Thank you for joining us this week for our talk on the Progressive Era. This is the time period when the problems from the Gilded Age will be finally brought to light, and both people and the government will begin to make changes to affect positive outcome. The word progress is obvious, right? This is kind of fun. In the late 1800s, what eventually would become the Social Security Administration started keeping track of baby names. So it's kind of neat to see in here. We have some names that we think of kind of maybe as classic names, others that have fallen out of popularity. But we'll come back to these again throughout the semester just to see how things change. It's kind of fun. So the origins of progressivism. Take a look at this image. The people living in these conditions, how many do you count? It's hard enough just to count on the heads, right? But you see feet, you see other parts of bodies, legs coming from the side, people living in squalor. Now, if you had not been aware that people were living like this, what might be your gut reaction? You'd likely want to make some change, right? You'd want something to be done to improve the situation these people find themselves in. These are the results of Jacob Riis, who was a photojournalist, a muckraker, who wrote a book called How the Other Half Lives. His idea was to expose to the upper half of society how the other half was living, the half that they didn't see. He would take these images and give these talks, these speeches, where he would project them and show them to an audience. People who saw this would react and want some change. When we talk about the progressive era, there are a lot of different groups that are involved. The first one, people like Jacob Riis, were muckrakers. These were journalists who were trying to get some change in society. They would expose problems like Riis. It could be urban poverty, it could be child labor, it could be the fact that lynchings were still occurring in huge numbers. It can be the corrupt business practices of people like Rockefeller. But muckrakers will expose these problems, the muck, the dirt, right? The things that people don't usually like to see, to bring them to light. Temperance is something that had been worked on since the early to mid 1800s. People since that time had encouraged people to limit their consumption of alcohol or to even stop or for the government to prohibit consumption of alcohol. Their goals will be realized with prohibition with a constitutional amendment during the Progressive Era. Another amendment that will come out, we all know, is the 19th Amendment, women's suffrage. Suffragists had been working since the founding of America to ensure that women had the right to vote. So now they'll actually be able to get that change. Populists were a group of a broad swath of the population that saw the inequities of the Gilded Age and said, you know what, Rockefeller shouldn't be worth more than 1 million everyday Americans, that maybe that wealth should be redistributed. So populists will want things to come to a close where they see a more equitable society. The Goo Goos have a fun name. The Good Government Guys were just like they sounded. They wanted some changes made to the way the government worked, and they will be successful. We'll see in just a minute. A lot of the progressive movement was significantly led by women, by middle class and upper class women who saw problems, demanded change, and would actually affect the change themselves. They would go to volunteer to make positive contributions, positive changes in society. Labor unions, of course, they usually want benefits for their workers. They will push for a shorter workday, maybe paid holidays, things like sick leave. They will also advocate to ban child labor, although we'll see in a little bit that maybe their motives weren't quite so altruistic on that one. And finally, civil rights. Civil rights is something that there had been some positive change during the Reconstruction era. As Reconstruction ended, we know in the South, civil rights were scaled back, rights that African Americans had fought were sadly lost. And that trend will largely continue in the progressive era. There will be some leaders like W.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington that will work to galvanize change, but in terms of legislation, the progressive era is almost a backslide in in civil rights. So let's talk about some election changes. We all know, I think, even though it was before the time of most people watching this video, that Arnold Schwarzenegger was the governor of California for a period of time. He became governor when a system of recall was instituted against the former governor, Gray Davis. In a recall, this is a progressive change where the people of a state think that their elected official is so bad that they don't even want to wait the 2 years, 4 years, however long for their next election to vote them out. So in a recall election, it basically gives the people, the citizenry, the power to impeach, if you want to think of it that way, an elected official. That's how Schwarzenegger got elected when the previous governor had been recalled. Several states had them. Other states did not. Texas, for example, did not have the recall election. States throughout the country, however, had referendums and initiatives, and these are both giving the citizenry, again, maybe legislative power or executive power that they never had before. With the initiative, people could propose a law, so that's something that the legislature, right, had normally done through a petition process. And with the referendum process, the citizenry of a state is able to vote to make a proposal a law rather than waiting for the mayor or the governor to sign it into law. So these changes tend to be found at the state level. There is one change at the national level, and that's the direct election of senators through the 17th Amendment. Now you might think, well, wait, haven't we always elected our senators? We really haven't. We had an indirect system that was set up in the Constitution that a lot of people would say was not really that democratic. The way it worked was that the lawmakers in the state capital, so say the state lawmakers in Austin, they would get together and they would decide who would be the 2 U.S. senators from Texas to go to Washington, D.C. So the idea was that, okay, the people voted on their state legislators, so they're indirectly choosing the senator because they're choosing the people who would choose the senator. A lot of people during the progressive era felt that wasn't very fair. You can see how there would be room for shenanigans, right? You get all the state lawmakers in the state capitol, and how are they going to pick the U.S. senator? Will there be offers of favors being exchanged? Will there be bribes? Will there be promises? There's a room for a lot of corruption. And so this is a change that comes about in the 17th Amendment. So like we said, women were really the leaders in the progressive movement. They were making change, whereas a lot of men weren't. And they did things like they used their traditional stereotypical role as wives and mothers to their advantage in affecting change, right? They would say, we as women need to protect children. Well, we can't protect children when they're working in factories like the one pictured below. We can't protect our families when our cities are filthy and disease is spreading. So they'll use that approach, and we'll see a great piece of rhetoric from Jane Addams a little bit later, where she is showing just how she wants that change to happen. They'll focus again on issues like child labor, and we'll get the first child labor law that becomes national in 1916. Unfortunately, it only lasts a couple of years before the Supreme Court rules it an unconstitutional use of federal power, but states will pick up the mantle and begin to pass their own child labor laws during the progressive era. So Jane Addams, who was she? Jane Addams was one of the most influential progressives, and she started Hull House. Hull House was a settlement house in Chicago, and it was, if you want to think of it like maybe a community center where they would offer classes, programs, some basic health care to people who were impoverished, people who were new to the country. They might learn English. They might get some basic health care needs met. The unique thing about her model is that when you hear settlement house, it's not a house for people who are in need of the services. A settlement house is staffed by volunteers. So these are the middle class and upper class women who would actually leave their homes, and they would kind of live kind of in a dorm situation in these settlement houses. So the settlement houses were houses for the volunteers who would then serve the community. This model will be replicated in cities throughout the United States as a successful way to enact change. This is a map of Chicago in 1895 in the middle of the Progressive Era. And you might have to pinch to zoom to see it all. But really, what's going on here is that we can see that these several blocks in Chicago, it's a good illustration of how immigration had changed in the late 1800s to really Southern and Eastern European immigrants. So we see Italian neighborhoods, we see Turkish neighborhoods, Russian neighborhoods. So these are groups that Hull House would serve. Another muckraker, another journalist trying to expose corruption was Lewis Hine. Lewis Hine was hired to document child labor. And so he would take these almost haunting images of children working in factories and mines out on the streets, and he would interview them as well. So here we see a girl who's only 4'3" and she's making 48 cents a day running both sides of this textile machinery. And when asked how old she is, she says, well, she doesn't know, but she knows that she's not old enough to really be working there. Here's another one who's been working in the mills. He's 12 years old, but he doesn't know his ABCs. He can't read or write. This is something that children begin learning at age 5 in kindergarten, or maybe even before that in pre-K. But this, like we said, when they're at work, they're not in school, and what will that do to the population? Right? They won't have the ability to advance. And just count the number of safety violations here, right? The number of ways that these children could be injured, again, working making clothing or other textiles. So people, as they see this, right, they'll demand and they'll want real change. In terms of other pieces of change, this is kind of an interesting case where we'll start to see restrictions on work hours. However, they're divided on gender lines. And this is in some ways a success in that women's working hours were limited, in this case in Oregon. However, the logic, the way that they got there, the legal maneuverings weren't exactly equitable. And so in Mueller versus Oregon, we have a Supreme Court case in which a future influential Supreme Court Justice, Louis D. Brandeis, will argue that laws limiting women to 8 hours a day are constitutional. So the state of Oregon had passed laws saying that women cannot work more than 8 hours a day. And the business owner was suing, saying that that law should not stand. Women, through Brandeis's work, were able to win the shorter workday. However, the logic that he got there with was, again, not maybe what we would necessarily agree with today. What he said was that women could or should not be forced to work these long hours, right? Because it could harm their role as mothers, as future mothers. It could be harmful to their bodies. So there is a upholding of work hours here in Oregon. Later on, labor unions will work to get in different industries a limit to their work hours. Kind of an interesting thing about unions, if we go back for a second, think about it. Why might unions want to end child labor. Now they might want to do it out of the kindness of their heart, right? But think again, maybe more cynically, how could that benefit the union membership? If there aren't kids working in the factories, right, that means then that all the jobs will have to go to adults. So you can see that uh, children, right, they're doing work that they shouldn't, getting paid a lot less than adults. So that's one reason why unions support laws limiting child labor. An influential event was the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, which was in New York City. Shirtwaists were a garment. And in this building, there was a fire that was started probably from a cigarette or something else that was tossed into flammable rags. And because the company did not trust its female workers, doors were locked, fire escapes were locked. They were afraid that they would steal clothing. And when this fire breaks out, almost 150 women are killed, and they're either overcome by fumes or a lot of them are sadly burned to death. And people who witness this, they see women jumping out of the windows, right, rather than being burnt alive. So think of the horror that this would instill in society. And again, wouldn't you want change? This highlighted poor working conditions and really a lack of safety standards will lead to our first modern fire code. If you think about public buildings, the doors open outward, right? So in the event of an emergency, you wouldn't want the door opening inward. That's just a choke point where people could trip or it would get in the way. So that's one example. But things like fire escapes, fire extinguishers, right? Today we have smoke detectors, carbon monoxide detectors. All of those things fortunately come out of this event. Until September 11th, this was the most deadly workplace incident in New York City history. Uniquely, the building is still around today. It's part of the NYU campus, and it's, I believe, a biology lab when I took this picture. But it just goes to show that people, right, especially in crowded cities where fire is such an issue, will want and get change. Political cartoons were very key during the Progressive Era, as we can see from these down here. These are in the aftermath of the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. We see the Grim Reaper running the sewing machine, right, to the expense of the workers. We see on the right the business owner shedding tears. Maybe they're fake tears, because what's their motive? Profit. Another change that will come about during the progressive era, like we said, is prohibition. Prohibition, or the movement to moderate or temper people's desire for alcohol, like we said, had been around since the early 1800s, mainly led by women again. If you think about it, right, why would women be more anti-alcohol than men? Part of it was the culture. Drinking for women in general was not encouraged, certainly not outside of the home. But you also had a lot of men who were factory workers that maybe didn't earn that much. And what would they do on their payday? They would take it and they might drink away half their earnings at the bar and come home with little to support their family. You, of course, have the potential for domestic abuse, child abuse, absent fathers, right, who are already working 10, 12-hour workdays and then being gone drinking, not to mention the health effects as well. So they will be successful with the constitutional amendment that is going to ban alcohol for a period of about 10 years. Famous leader in this effort was Carrie Nation. You see her real life picture down there, but the political cartoon has her as Joan of Arc, right? It says a woman's holy war. So she's on a war to end the consumption of alcohol. There was a fascinating documentary by Ken Burns about 10 years ago about prohibition. One of the things that they point out was it wasn't just women who supported uh, prohibition, but you also had groups like the KKK because they saw Jews, Catholics, and other Southern and Eastern European immigrants as being maybe more likely to consume alcohol than they were. And so that was one way that they could, right, attack these groups through banning alcohol. You also had soda companies that would encourage prohibition, right? Because if you can't drink alcohol, you'll need to get need to wet your whistle in another way. So in this case, right, using uh, consuming soda water was something that benefited from prohibition. The 19th Amendment, like we said, was passed in 1920. And we have, right, the success for women that was 150 years in the making. About 60 years after all men got the right to vote, women still had to wait for their right to vote. So here's a great piece of rhetoric. This is Jane Addams saying why women should vote. And as you read this, she points out, right, she's going to take that argument. She's going to say, okay, let's use that sexist argument that, right, women should just worry about keeping their house clean and wholesome and taking care of their children. She says, okay, I'll go along with that argument for a second, but think about this, right? How can I keep my family safe if there's no fire escape? Because the lawmakers and the city government don't care to have fire escapes as a requirement. How can I keep my family safe if meat has not been inspected and it's dirty, and whatever meat I buy my children might lead to food poisoning or maybe even death? How can I keep my family safe, right? If there's all these problems, and what she's implying is that these problems have been there for a long time. Men have been in control for a long time, and have men been able to address them? No, not yet, right? So what is she saying? She's saying women need the vote so that they can enact this change that will help fulfill their roles as mothers, as caretakers. So it's a great use of turning an argument that somebody might use against them to really get to what you want yourself. Teddy Roosevelt. So let's talk about some presidents. Teddy Roosevelt was one of the, really, a lot of people consider the first progressive president. We saw last week that he took over after the assassination of William McKinley. And he's going to have, he calls his plan the square deal. So he's got nice marketing behind his plan. He's going to really make reforms that target businesses, that protect consumers, and that take care of the environment. So let's explore these. You know, for the longest time, we had in the United States a laissez-faire form of government where the government kept their hands off businesses. They didn't get involved. They kind of let them do whatever they want. And that obviously was not good for consumers. In fact, other presidents in the past, when groups had gone on strike, the president would order them back to work or would order federal troops in to break up the strike. So business owners were used to really just getting their way when contract negotiations broke down. This will change during Roosevelt's administration. There's a strike in Pennsylvania where the workers are asking for a 20% wage increase. And the owners, like always, they're like, hey, we're not going to compromise. You know, we know eventually the president or someone will have our back that's in authority. Teddy, however, he summons both sides to the White House. He says, hey, tell me why you want this. Tell me why you want this. And for the first time, he says, you know what? That's not going to fly. Mine owners, you need to reach some kind of agreement with your workers. Remember, coal was what fueled the country. Gasoline wasn't really a thing yet. We, of course, don't have solar power at this time. So coal was how the country was powered. And Teddy says to the mine owners, you know what? Because coal is a national resource, it's what makes the country go. This strike could become a national emergency. And coal mine owners, if you don't work out a deal with your miners, Teddy, the government will take over the mines in the interest of national security. And so at that point, of course, the mine owners are forced to negotiate and they arrive at a 10% increase for their workers and a limit to a 9-hour workday. Teddy Roosevelt will also, we talked about last time, or 2 times ago, we talked about antitrust acts. And Teddy Roosevelt is going to break up trusts. So we see him on the left as a lion tamer. There are all sorts of trusts. Some he'll break up. Those are the bad trusts. Other good trusts, he'll kind of rein them in, like we see on the right. He'll put a leash on them. But Teddy Roosevelt will become the first trust buster as a president. Among the most controversial things that gets people's attention during this time is a novel, something that you have an assignment that you're reading called The Jungle. Jungle is by Upton Sinclair, and it's a book about larger problems in society. But as part of his research for the book, Upton Sinclair works for a while in a meatpacking plant. He wants to go undercover and do research to make his characters as authentic as possible. And he puts details from his own discoveries into the book, The Jungle. And while the story itself is notable and unique, it's really the public reaction to the details that will get people's attention. It's said that he was aiming for the nation's heart, but instead hit them in the stomach. And he really shows the problems that exist in the meatpacking plant, where profits were the thing that was stressed the most. Check out this reading from The Jungle. There would be meat that had tumbled out onto the floor in the dirt and sawdust where workers had tramped and spit. There would be meat stored in great piles in rooms, and the water from leaky roofs would drip all over it. And thousands of rats would race about on it. It was too dark in these strange places to see well, but a man could run his hand over the piles of meat and sweep off handfuls of the dry dung of rats. These rats were nuisances, and the packers would put poisoned bits of bread out for them. They would die, and then rats, bread, and meat would go into the hoppers together. This is no fairy story and no joke. The meat would be shoveled into carts, and the man who did the shoveling would not trouble to lift out a rat. There were things that went into the sausage in comparison with which a poison rat was a tidbit. Not even something to worry about. What's one little poison rat in the midst of a hopper with, 100 pounds of ground meat in it? So, we have the joke today about, oh, you shouldn't eat hot dogs. Hot dogs are gross. Well, that really comes from these stories back then about the meat packing industry. Any meat that's ground, right? You don't know exactly what it is. If you buy a chicken breast or a steak at the store, you can see it's one solid piece of meat and you know if it's good or bad, right? But when you're throwing all sorts of pieces of meat, whether they're good meat that you want to eat or pieces that maybe aren't so desirable, once they're ground up, you're not going to know what's in there. And so you can imagine, right, people reading this story, what would you think if you heard this? What if this came out today, right? What if this was exposed online, breaking news? You'd want action, right? You'd want the government to do something. And so Teddy sees this and he responds with a few different things. So here we have a political cartoon showing the meat scandal, all bits and pieces of animals in there. But Teddy's going to see it, and in addition to other legislators, call for change. And the first big change is the Meat Inspection Act. It says that the government will have meat inspectors that go into factories to make sure that they are following basic guidelines. It can't be there all the time, right? But this is a check that really hadn't existed before in the old laissez-faire form of governance. The other thing they had was the Pure Food and Drug Act, which will say not only food should be inspected, but medicines as well. There were lots of medicines where You didn't know what you were getting. It was unregulated. It might be advertised as one thing, but you're getting something else. There was no quality control. You might have 10 times the amount of the medicine that you were supposed to get if there indeed was medicine in it at all. So this idea, right, is something that we come to expect now. We expect that when we buy ibuprofen that we're going to get the amount that's in there, and then it's right that it's not contaminated. But that was not in existence until the progressive era. So that's a real change for consumers that came about during this time period. In terms of the environment, Teddy Roosevelt was a conservationist. He was an outdoorsman. He hunted, he camped, he went on adventures, and he really appreciated the need to preserve nature. This is at a time going back to the mid 1800s where people started to realize that our resources are not endless, that you had these beautiful places like Yosemite in California that miners were ready to come in and just strip mine, just dig into the earth to get to the valuable materials beneath the surface. But Teddy Roosevelt, along with others, are going to enact change. So you can see Teddy's achievements on the screen. He's pictured here with John Muir, who was one of the first people to really advocate for preservation of forests. And setting aside national forests is something that Teddy Roosevelt will do. Teddy didn't create the first national park, but he added to it. And he really added to the idea that we did need to conserve what we have so that it's around for their use then, but also for our enjoyment today. This is a great quote from Teddy. He spent 3 days camping in Yosemite with John Muir, who we saw in the last image, and he's really exposed to the beauty that existed, and it really reaffirmed his desire to set aside as much land as possible for public protection. So Teddy comes to the end of his 2 terms, and like Washington and everyone before him, he decided that he would stop after 2 terms. And so he really handpicked his Secretary of War, William Howard Taft, to be his replacement. He campaigned uh, strongly for Taft, and Taft wins his election. Taft will continue the trust busting that Teddy Roosevelt did. He'll actually bust double the number of trusts that Teddy Roosevelt did. So he'll continue those reforms. Taft will continue exerting American influence in other parts of the world through dollar diplomacy, which is just like it sounds. It's using our financial might to get things that we want in other parts of the world. That could be good for America, but may not be as good for the other countries that were being subjected to America's will. But Taft will he'll have some successes as president, but he'll also have a few challenges. And what happens is Teddy Roosevelt starts to think maybe he should have run for a 3rd term, and people are whispering in his ear, Taft isn't doing a very good job. And so what's going to happen is Teddy will decide that he's going to run again for a 3rd term, a non-consecutive term, when Taft comes up for re-election. So you have these 2 people that were once friends that really become enemies. And so think about it. What happens when you have 2 presidents from the same party running against each other? The party obviously has to pick one of them. And so Teddy Roosevelt will form a 3rd party. He calls it the Bull Moose Party. It's also called the Progressive Party. But this, as you can imagine, will split Republican voters. They don't know, do they go back to Teddy, who did some great things, or do they stick with Taft, who they voted for overwhelmingly when he first got elected? And so the election of 1912 will be a very consequential election. This is a cool map just to check out. So take a minute to look at it, look at the numbers. As you can imagine, we said with the Republican Party split, that will hand the victory very easily to the Democrat, Woodrow Wilson. Wilson is from the South. He'll be the first Southerner elected since before the Civil War. And what do we see here? Look at the totals for Roosevelt and Taft. We see in the Electoral College, which is what really counts, right? Getting those votes to win. But look more closely at the popular vote, because that shows just how divided the public was. Say Teddy Roosevelt hadn't run for this third term, right? That's 7.5 million votes that potentially could have gone to Taft. Look at Wilson's total, right? So Taft conceivably could have beat Wilson in that election, except Teddy was there playing the spoiler. So it's kind of unique to see. Eugene Debs had been around for a while. He was a populist. He was a socialist. He'll famously run for president in 1920 from prison, as being convicted later on of violating the Sedition Act, speaking out against World War One. But it's a unique election, and that, of course, leads to Wilson, who's our final progressive president. He will do several things that were in your readings. He'll have the Federal Reserve Act, which sets up the Federal Reserve. They, most famously, as we see in the news right now, they control really interest rates for borrowing money throughout the nation. So that's one achievement of Wilson's. The Clayton Antitrust Act will put more teeth in previous antitrust legislation. The Federal Trade Commission will set regulations and requirements for businesses to hopefully cut down on shady practices. And Wilson will support the 17th Amendment, the direct election of senators, and the 19th Amendment, the women's suffrage amendment. So he has these things that really seem progressive, right? Some definite progressive achievements. Wilson, however, also is not progressive in a lot of ways. When we first started out, we said the progressive era was not a time of progress for people of color. And Wilson he's a racist, he's a segregationist. And there had been integration efforts in the federal government with the presidents before him, but Wilson actually rolls those back. So he kind of resegregates parts of the federal government, the federal workforce. He, as a writer, he supported the lost cause myth, the myth that the South was destined to win the Civil War, that their cause was righteous, except they were just simply overpowered by the Union. So that, along with praising the KKK for what he saw as its work, as in his mind its positive benefits, really shows that Wilson is kind of has two sides to the coin. There are some areas in which he is progressive, and then there's other areas where he's the exact opposite of progress. So that concludes our talk today on the progressive era. Thank you for watching. Please feel free to let me know if you have any questions. As always, again, thanks for watching. I appreciate it. This presentation was created by me, and all rights are reserved. Thanks.